Harold, I'm glad you made it. Actually, we are in competition with, among other things, an international wine and food festival. And so we are so much on top of it. The Lincoln Institute is so much on top of these things that naturally, as you know, we are providing our own lunch for free. So I think that's very good that we are having our own international festival, so to speak. And also, I must say, if I say so myself as publicity chairman of the Lincoln Institute, this is, I believe, the largest turnout we've ever had in 8 years. So congratulations to you and our speakers. Now, this being a Lincoln group and a Lincoln organization, naturally I will begin with a quote from Franklin Roosevelt. However, if ever a man had his rendezvous with destiny, it is our speaker, because he is truly the whirlwind from New York. In fact, he's the whirlwind of the country. People usually say, if it's appropriate, that we have a man who's had quite a year. This man has had quite a month. Exactly 1 month ago, he and Sam Waterston entertained at the White House with President Bush on his Lincoln activities. And most people who were worthy were there, who could fit in. Some people who were worthy couldn't make it, but they were still there in spirit. And I'd also want to say that in this 1 month, not only was it that, but he received the second place Lincoln Prize, and the Lincoln Prize is the highest award for Lincoln that you can get in the country, and he received second place for that, just a few days after the White House. And just moments ago, he was informed that he received the highest award of the Lincoln Group of the District of Columbia, the Lincoln Award for his book on Lincoln and Cooper Union. So this has been quite a time for him. Now, he didn't want me to mention this, but once it's in the New York Times, it's really out, you know. How did Harold Holzer get interested in Lincoln? And it turns out that as a young man, as a very young schoolboy, he had a choice. He put his hand, I guess, in a hat or something, and he, fortunately for the whole nation and for the world, chose the name Abraham Lincoln. But the fellow in front of him or behind him got Genghis Khan to write about. I really don't see Harold heralding Genghis Khan and starting a movement for Genghis Khan, but if anybody could have done it, it would have been Harold. I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker, who has so many credits, it's hard to believe, but he's chairman of the United States Abraham Lincoln Bicentennial Commission, vice chairman of the Lincoln Forum. He's senior, I love this title, senior for external affairs for the New York Metropolitan Museum of Art. When I told that to our secretary, he said, "Do they have a State Department at the Museum of Art?" Nevertheless, a man who has personified Lincoln studies, and to speak on Lincoln and Cooper Union, the speech that made Lincoln president, his own book, Harold Holzer.
Good morning. You all look beautiful out there. Great crowd, and it's wonderful to be here. You know, and thank you for taking me out of order, and apologies for my delay from New York. You know, for about 4 years, I sought all over the country the answer to the question of how everything worked so perfectly for Abraham Lincoln. Why was it such a triumph at Cooper Union? Was it the writing? Was it the audience? What combination? Well, I finally figured out what it was. He was smart enough not to take U.S. Air. I've just spent 3 hours and 10 minutes on a 33-minute flight. And I have to share this because Bob is so furious at me. I want to explain why that's good for the routine, to pretend that you're furious at me. The rule, as you may know, for those of you who've taken the shuttle, is that you're not permitted to use the lavatories for security reasons. Unfortunately, that rule was imposed while we were on the tarmac at LaGuardia getting de-iced. And of course, there were no de-icing trucks, so that was the problem. And we had a really angry group of people, I have to tell you. Anyway, thank you all for having me, and thank you for being patient, and thank you for asking me to speak one more time and asking me to search my mind for one more take and riff, I suppose, on Cooper Union, about which you may have heard over this last 10 months that I've been speaking about it around the country. The premise for the book was that it was the speech that, in short, made Abraham Lincoln president. It's always been known as that, and I must say that after studying it closely for 3 or 4 years, I could not come up with a counter-proposal. I do believe that more than anything else, it elevated Lincoln into the realm of favorites and frontrunners for the presidential nomination of 1860. He, as usual, was rather self-effacing about it. The only report about his own assessment of the speech, and of course it runs, well, there are two, we'll get to one later, his letter to his wife. The speech went off without incident. That was the most he ever said directly about it. But when he came back to the West and was posing for a sculpture in the studio of Leonard Volk in Chicago, Volk recorded many years later, publishing it in the 1880s, that Lincoln spoke about Cooper Union, and in his usual offhanded manner said that he had written the entire speech on the cars, meaning the train, not U.S. Air, on the cars between Camden and Jersey City. Now, that has about as much credibility as writing the Gettysburg Address on the back of an envelope. 7,500 words is the total. An extraordinarily dense, closely argued, well-researched speech. How in the world did a speech like that play for a largely political audience? Well, to imagine the effect it had, I think requires a huge leap of historical imagination, requires us to think back to the political culture of 1859, 1860. Of course, no cable news to get the headlines, no internet blogging, no sound bites. The candidates of the day were expected to give long, serious, well-performed speeches for hours at a time. The American audience loved politics, loved political rhetoric. Think of people living in isolated communities throughout the country, deprived of entertainments, really. There was church on Sunday, there was the state fair, and there was politics. New York should have been an exception. As I'll mention as we go on, there were a lot of diversions in New York around the time Lincoln came, and yet the audience didn't want to leave even after hearing a 90-minute to 2-hour speech. They got 4 more speeches out of people in the audience before it was all over. They kept demanding more speakers. How about the hosts? How about the fire chief? Now, did Lincoln take it seriously, the opportunity, or was it just another opportunity? Well, I like to do my cinematic version of the moment at which he's invited to this occasion. And I keep doing this in the hope that there will someday be a movie producer in an audience that agrees with me that this is terribly cinematic and irresistible and has to be adapted immediately into a television movie. But anyway, Lincoln has spent September, October of 1859 campaigning for Republican candidates in Ohio. He finds himself in Clinton, Illinois, on a legal case when the election results begin to filter in. These are October elections, state elections. And realizes, as do his friends in Clinton, that there's a huge Republican groundswell. Victories in Ohio and in Indiana and in Pennsylvania. So his friends give him a little party in Clinton to toast him. After all, his campaigning, his writings have helped ensure Republican successes. Now, what can we reasonably surmise was going on in Lincoln's head at this time? I think, reasonably, at the very least, the expectation that in its second national election, coming in 1 year, the new Republican Party would be extremely competitive for the presidency. Now, whether he was harboring any thoughts about himself might have waited until he got home. He takes the train back to Springfield the next morning, arrives in town, walks from the station to his house, and after he greets his family, I'm supposing, and I admitted that I imagined this a little bit, he does what I do when I get home from a trip, and that's I go right to the mail to see what bills are overdue, et cetera, et cetera. He might not have had bills, but he certainly had a pile of mail. And if we know Mary, and we think we do, she probably put the telegram on the top. Maybe she thought it was from another lady, you know how jealous she was. But the telegram surely was high up there on the pile of letters for him to examine. As he's opening the telegram, the local marching band in Springfield has assembled, put on its ragtag uniforms, taken their instruments, and begun to play a serenade for him outside of his house, probably off-key, to salute him also on these victories in Ohio and Pennsylvania. So you see, we don't even need a music score. We have the music for the occasion, for the movie version. And he opens up the telegram, and it says, "Will you speak in Broolyn?" Broolyn. The telegraph operator in Springfield didn't even know what Brooklyn was. Honorarium $200. Now, I don't think for a minute, as some people have surmised, that the honorarium was the deciding factor, nor do I think that it was an irresistible opportunity to see his son, as some have written, who's away at boarding school at Exeter, because his son had only been gone for about 6 weeks at the moment that that invitation came. And although he had already received 3 or 4 letters from Robert asking for money, he's a kid in school after all, he could have just said no. So I don't think it was Robert. I think he looks at this invitation and immediately understands its potential. He's been to New York and the East, but he's never spoken in New York City, then as now the media center of the United States. I think he sensed the opportunity immediately. I think he understood what it meant politically. He might even have recognized the names of the people who were organizing the event. They called themselves the Young Men's Central Republican Union, but what they were, plain and simple, was an anti-Seward group of Republicans and pro-Salmon P. Chase, as it happened. They were a group of young Republicans from New York who, for various reasons, didn't like Senator Seward. Part of it was an upstate, downstate division that's always existed in New York, and those of you who know New York may know that that still exists between politicians and the regions. But also, and here's something we heard in the last election, there was, and the word was different, but the issue was the same. Remember hearing during the Democratic primary season the word electability? John Kerry was the right nominee for the Democratic Party because he was electable. Dr. Dean wasn't electable. Well, the New Yorkers who organized this event, and it wasn't just a Lincoln event, as I'll tell you in a moment, believed that Seward would win New York, and he would win the blue states, but he wouldn't necessarily win the red states. Of course, blue and gray was much worse than blue and red, but they thought that they needed a Westerner who would win the same blue states, the same eastern states, but also be competitive in Indiana, Ohio, and Illinois, where a Seward might lose. That was the rationale for a lecture series organized at Beecher's Church in Brooklyn, one of the shrines to the abolitionist movement. People who have argued in the past that the Cooper Union speech was not a resolutely anti-slavery speech, that it was conservative in the sense that it wasn't toned to reflect Lincoln's anti-slavery feeling, and Alan Gelzo and I have debated this for a few months and probably will continue to do so, should understand that it was written for and intended to be delivered at a place in New York where Henry Ward Beecher had actually held a mock slave auction to publicly purchase and liberate a slave woman, filled with abolitionist rhetoric every Sunday, rhetoric that was published in the New York Independent the next week routinely. Well, Lincoln has to think about what he will write. One of the other issues going through his mind is that he has wanted for some years to be a professional lecturer. We know about Lincoln's two careers, the law and politics. I think he may have had a third career, at least in the back of his mind, because all sophisticated, learned people also performed and attended lectures. And Lincoln had devised a lecture on discoveries and inventions, as he called it, that was probably one of the worst pieces of writing for public delivery that he ever concocted. He did it in several sections or perhaps a revision after the first version. It never really played. It embarrassed his friends, Herndon, others. There were famous stories about people demanding their 25 cents back after hearing it. One day Lincoln gave the 25 cents back to everybody. One time the crowd was so sparse that he didn't even bother to deliver it. So I think in the back of his mind is the idea of doing a lecture that would work. And he tells his hosts he will do a lecture, a political lecture, because he's asked to choose his subject. About a month before, his arch rival, Stephen A. Douglas, had published a piece in Harper's New Monthly magazine. Actually, when you think about these debaters and opponents for so many years, Douglas preceded Abraham Lincoln to New York. He made a secret trip to New York to huddle with Mr. Harper, the publisher of the magazine, and devised this idea to present Stephen Douglas's views on slavery in an issue of Harper's. This is sort of like President Bush making a trip to Rolling Stone magazine to discuss a piece on his Mideast policy. It was very unusual. And the piece came out and took the country by storm, both pro and con, because in it, Douglas maintained that the framers of the government, the founders, had not believed that the federal government had authority over slavery in new territories. Lincoln decided to take this as his theme. He had already been attacking the article on his political campaign stump in Ohio, and he decided that he would do a complete, thorough reply to Douglas. That's what he did for a living. He opposed Stephen A. Douglas. He replied to Stephen A. Douglas. Here was a great opportunity. I get to debate Stephen A. Douglas, and he can't answer. He's going to be back in Washington. I'll be in New York by myself. It's much better to debate him if he can't do a rejoinder. So he sets to work. Now, most of us who think about Lincoln oratory, I think too often think about these speech opportunities as an invitation. Lincoln sits down and writes a speech. Lincoln goes off and delivers a speech. It wasn't that easy. Checking carefully into Lincoln's schedule, at the time of his preparation of Cooper Union, I found his schedule riddled with so many diversions and complications that I found it doubly extraordinary that he was able to not only write but research this speech. A, he was continuing his law practice, active in cases. B, he was trying to see to the publication of the Lincoln-Douglas debates in book form, which he also knew would be beneficial to him by spreading a slightly revised and edited version to Eastern audiences. Third, he suddenly found himself embroiled in an internecine Republican Party dispute in Illinois. Parenthetical to this, he was trying to get the Chicago Press and Tribune to endorse him for the presidential nomination before he left for New York. I think that's one of the reasons he kept postponing his trip, which he did. It might have been November, it might have been December, it wound up being the end of February. I think he wanted that favorite son endorsement in the bag. It was very important to him. Anyone who thinks that Lincoln didn't write Cooper Union with the presidency in mind has to look at his campaign to get the Chicago Press and Tribune presidential endorsement at the same time. Suddenly there's a feud between the mayor of Chicago and his old friend Norman Judd over whether Judd had been a good campaigner for Lincoln for the Senate in Lincoln's two previous tries for the Senate. Well, Wentworth says he's not. Judd said he is. Judd sues Wentworth for $100,000 and asks Lincoln to be his lawyer. It's a total mess. And it's the last thing Abraham Lincoln needs, especially when they're trying to get the Republican National Convention to commit to Chicago. I think they're right on the brink of getting that done. But Chicago is a mess at the moment, the site of this holy war between these two characters. By the way, he did settle the dispute. He did get the Chicago Press and Tribune endorsement, and all was peaceful. But meanwhile, comes the task, with all of this going on in his head, also writing his first autobiographical sketch, which is important because it's another introductory exercise for Eastern readers. He knows that to counter Stephen Douglas's research, which was conducted with the assistance of a legislative aide and George Bancroft, no less, who did some research for him, that Lincoln would have to delve deeply into the records of the Constitutional Convention, not only the national, but in the several states. And he had no one helping him. I think Herndon, who usually did research for him, was a little bit resentful that the law practice was left on his head while Lincoln went off to the state library, often working late into the night to assemble his evidence. He read James Kent's commentaries on the Constitution, Lanham's Dictionary of Congress, the papers of Washington, the life of Lafayette, the works of Alexander Hamilton, the lives of the signers, back issues of the New York Tribune, back issues of the Springfield newspapers, the life of Benjamin Franklin, the Annals of Congress and the Congressional Globe, the two early recordings of congressional proceedings that we now call the Congressional Record. Of course, went back and read the Douglas article, The Dividing Line, in Harper's, which was 19 pages long in the magazine. He reread his own speeches, 7,500 words. The only laptop he had, of course, was the board that he used on his lap when he was writing. It's hard to imagine that kind of close work, physically arduous work, not only in the research but in the writing. This is what Lincoln conducted before he was ready to leave. Well, comes the time when he's ready to go to New York. He faces a journey of 1,400 miles in the days when there was no Amtrak, let alone U.S. Air, and the trip requires changing trains in city after city as the lines change, the grades change, the time zones change, racing after trains you're about to miss or waiting endlessly for trains that are late. And Mary Lincoln has a final surprise for him. She says, as long as you're going, now of course I'm paraphrasing, she probably didn't say it that way, as long as you're going, dear, my cousin, Elizabeth Smith, needs to go to Philadelphia. Her husband has left her here in Springfield. He's gone off to look for a job. He's a ne'er-do-well. You've got to go with, this is a perfect opportunity. She needs to go back to Philadelphia. You ride with her on the train. And while, she'll make sure you wear this woolen hat I've made for you because the railroad cars are cold. She'll give you your lunches. Well, anyway, Mrs. Smith goes along, and then Mrs. Smith's surprise is Dudley. 2 years old. He goes on the trip too. Can you imagine how difficult it was to work on that train trip? I don't think Lincoln was a great train writer anyway, but that's another story. 1,400 miles, 3 days. By the way, when he passed through Fort Wayne, the local Democratic newspaper could not help commenting that Mr. Lincoln is in town. He has just passed through on the railroad with a lovely woman who says that her name is Mrs. Smith. Well, he gets to New York. I want to paint the scene. I'm not going to have time to do too much on the speech, but that's okay. I like painting the scene even better. He gets to Jersey City, the last stop on all of these train lines, and then gets in a ferry that goes from Jersey City to lower New York, sharing the ferry with horses and carriages and masses of people. No one is there to meet him at the dock. He probably has read all the warnings about holding on to your belongings, to watch out for petty thieves along the waterfront. He walks along the streets past places that would lie in the shadow of the World Trade Center one day and gets to Broadway and makes a left and goes to the spot that's about where the Woolworth building is today, opposite City Hall. opposite Barnum's gaudy museum, which Lincoln never entered as far as I know, and checks in to the Astor House, place where he and Mary stayed a few years before. It's the hotel he knows. And again, if he's like me, I'd love to think that, but if he's like most of us, he buys the local newspapers, probably wanting to see if he's in the newspaper. Is my speech being advertised at Beecher's church? Well, he opens the newspaper, and sure enough, there are notices in the Times and the Tribune that Mr. Lincoln, this is a Saturday, is to speak in 2 days at Cooper Institute. Well, I'm not even sure that Lincoln had heard of Cooper Institute. He probably had. What is this Cooper Institute? Well, it's the newest college in town. It's a free college. It's open to men and women. It has evening hours for working people. It has the largest auditorium in New York City. A funny auditorium. It's in the basement, because Peter Cooper firmly believes that in the event of fire, fewer people will be injured running upstairs than downstairs. That's the reason why it's downstairs. So Lincoln has a new task. As he says, he has to make a more secular arrangement of his speech. It's designed for a church. But of course, his hosts greet him. Well-wishers greet him. A non-relative named Lincoln greets him. An old friend from Springfield named Mason Brayman, who's a Democrat, greets him. On Sunday, he's obliged almost to go to Beecher's church. It's a tourist opportunity. It's something that people do when they go to New York. They go to Beecher's church to hear Henry Ward Beecher sermonize. Lincoln takes another ferry across Brooklyn, the East River to Brooklyn. By the way, not only is the Cooper Union still standing and the Great Hall still there in a different configuration, but still there, but so is Beecher's church. So is that fabulous chapel with no pillars. Cooper Union is riddled with pillars that still make it hard to see. Another myth, they moved Lincoln to Cooper Union because they needed a bigger auditorium. He was so popular. Well, A, he didn't fill the auditorium, and B, the Beecher Church auditorium with its balcony and no aisle in the center, because Reverend Beecher didn't like to look at aisles, is a bigger place. He just missed the series, is what happened. Well, he hears Beecher speaking about a wonderful, perfect sermon. What makes a gentleman of honor? It's not his clothes, it's his character. Lincoln must have liked that. His hosts try to get him to go to dinner, but now he puts his foot down. He's got to work. So he works on Sunday, rewriting, revising those 7,500 words. The next day, his hosts come and say, are you ready for your tour of Broadway? I don't know if Lincoln knew he had a tour of Broadway, but he certainly got one. A long walk up the great street of the metropolis with signage. That's what people always wrote about. Signs on every wall, on every window, for photographers and hatters and clothiers, and then marble buildings, great emporia, churches, houses of commerce. It was very impressive. Filled with mud, as we hear about many streets at the time, but terribly impressive. And at the end of this route, they find themselves in front of Matthew Brady's photography gallery, recently moved to a new location north in the city. Lincoln, if you read the history of Lincoln being photographed, he always finds himself in front of a photo gallery. He's always importuned into a photo gallery. He never says, I've got to have my picture taken, because this is an important event. But, you have to take these Victorian sensibilities with a grain of salt. He goes to have his photo taken. Now, if you look at the pre-Cooper Union photographs of Abraham Lincoln, they're not something that you would, for the most part, reproduce on a campaign poster. They show him with that long neck emerging from his big collars with funny-looking ties. I showed some of them at this White House event that Steve alluded to, and they even made President Bush laugh, so they must be very funny. And Matthew Brady, the greatest photographer in America, has a better idea. What's impressive about this man is his size, his imposing stature. So he backs up the camera, and he does a 3/4 or 2/3 to 3/4 length picture of Lincoln. He brings in a pillar as a prop. A pillar has meaning for people in the 19th century. It means statecraft. It means government, service. He brings a table and piles some books on it for Lincoln to lean his hand on. Maybe because he was so tall he couldn't reach the table, but the books signify learning and knowledge. So here he's got all these accoutrements which people are trained to look at in photographs, and at the last possible minute, Brady says, Mr. Lincoln, would you mind pulling your collar up? And Lincoln says, I see, sir, that you want to shorten my neck. And Brady says, yes, that's just it. And then quickly he takes the photograph, and what's recorded is a brilliant image that Brady later retouches and becomes, in the next months, the avenue by which Lincoln is introduced to the entire country in posters and banners and broadsides and campaign buttons. The other myth about Cooper Union is that the crowd was small because of snow. I finally found the meteorological records for New York. They were not kept routinely or easily, but both of the records I found showed that the temperature was over 50 degrees. I think the snow legend, which was written about by the hosts many years later as they were competing for credit for this great event, was owing to the fact that there had been a Washington's birthday snowstorm. And just like now, New York has a hard time digging out. So with melting snow and slush, it probably was sloppy. But what amazes me is that how difficult it must have been to perform at Cooper Union, because in the old days in New York, even when I went to school for my infamous hat trick with the name, they would put the boilers on in late October, and then they would turn the boilers off around Memorial Day. And it didn't matter if it was 50 degrees or 10 degrees, the boilers were on. And it must have been unbearable in Cooper Union that night. When Sam Waterston, who also did the Cooper Union address in May for 900 people, did it, it was climate controlled, and of course he used a microphone. Didn't have to shout and take deep breaths. He was absolutely bathed in sweat after 70 minutes, probably shorter time than Lincoln spoke, again, because of the microphone. So I can imagine that physically this was exhausting. After the trip down Broadway, after the last-minute rewrites. I haven't left much time to talk about the structure of the speech, and I think I won't. I'll just go on and talk about the event itself, because the speech is on the web, it's everywhere, it's in the book. You can certainly read it. I will say that it was a masterful defense of his position that the founders, at least the framers of the Constitution, the signers of the Constitution, had believed in the federal authority to limit the spread of slavery into the territories. He spoke for about an hour just on that, very legalistically, surprising the audience because they had expected a slam, bang, frontier orator waving his arms about. Somebody wrote that if they had put a silver dollar on the floor and put Lincoln's feet on either side of it when he started, when it was over, the dollar would not have moved. He didn't gesture. It was all in the shape, the moving of the head and the kindling of the eye. They all report the same thing. And in the subsequent speeches he did in New England, people report the same thing. For 10 minutes, they all write. I couldn't believe the accent. I couldn't believe how long his legs were. I saw his legs wrapped around the chair before he got up. He was so embarrassing. The people who heard him speak with Robert in the audience said Robert must have been embarrassed. And then after a while, they get into the spirit and listen to the words and are mesmerized by him. Forget about these reports about his being a poor speaker with a high voice, whatever that means. If it was a high voice, it was a Pavarotti tenor. These people who went into politics had to have the vocal equipment to be heard outdoors and indoors before large crowds. Never mind the people in the fringes who didn't hear. The people, in a room like this expected to hear everything. And they had the power to do it, or they wouldn't have been in politics. They couldn't have been in politics. Then he does a second part of the speech in which he turns the tables on his opponents in the South, his prospective opponents, says a few words to the South if they would listen, as I suppose they would not. This is an ancient Greek tradition. It's even better than debating Douglas when he's not there. Here he's debating the South when they're not there. And he says, don't ever expect to say with legitimacy that if a Republican is elected, you can legally and morally leave the Union. Because we're giving you fair warning that we're not a sectional party. We're not threatening slavery where it exists. We're only advocating limiting its spread into the territories, just like our fathers. He keeps saying our fathers, religious meaning, historical meaning, brilliant use of repetition. And then finally, the third element, I said I wasn't going to talk about the speech, but I'm doing a little. The third element is a few words to Republicans. And here he gathers himself and makes a grand moral statement about the evils of slavery and ends with the famous peroration, let us have faith that right makes might. And of course he brings the house down. one reporter in the audience who started jotting notes that said, "Old man, this won't do, this is New York," when he first heard Lincoln, writes that he thinks Lincoln is the greatest man since St. Paul when Lincoln is finished. And then all the speeches that follow. And then poor Lincoln, his Constitution, forget about the Constitution he talked about, his Constitution must have been extraordinary. He goes for a celebratory dinner at a private club with the young hosts, and he has to talk all evening about the presidency, who will be a stronger candidate in Illinois, you or Seward, and then they put him on the streetcar to go back to the Astor House. They don't even take him back to where he needs to go. Bob, don't get any ideas about tomorrow. And they notice he's limping from new boots. Another lesson for public speakers: you can buy a new suit, which Lincoln actually had wrinkled too much on the trip. Never buy new shoes for a speech. It's not a good idea. He could barely walk. But instead of going to the Astor House, he cuts across City Hall Park and goes to the offices of the New York Tribune. And there he reads proof, 2 sets of proofs of the speech. I think that there had been a predetermined way of getting this speech set in type. I think Lincoln may have even read the Cooper Union address from a draft set in type, because the 4 newspapers got the text and edited text very quickly and had it published the next morning. He's not at the newspaper offices till about 11 o'clock at night. The tragic thing about this is that, of course, in the true tradition of newspapers, when you finish with your original piece and it's okay and it's set in type and there's no more corrections, you take the original and you let it float to the floor. Lincoln knew the routine because he'd done this in Illinois with his major speeches. So the original is long gone. No one ever thought to save it. If anyone knows where it is, see Budge Weidman later to enter it in the archives collection. But still no rest for the weary. He wakes up the next morning, finds the speech published and praised in 3 morning newspapers, including a pro-Douglas paper, the Herald, which gives us the audience interruptions that very few people write about. A lot of cheering and laughter. One can imagine Lincoln amusing the crowd. And then he goes off en route to visit his son, but not before and during a period in which he gives reiterations of the speech in Providence, Concord and Manchester, New Hampshire, Dover, Exeter, Hartford, New Haven, Meriden, Woonsocket, Norwich, and Bridgeport, Connecticut. A crazy quilt schedule, if you can imagine it. So I think many of the invitations are coming in as he progresses on his journey. He refuses some. He won't go back to New Jersey to give another speech. He won't go to Philadelphia. He won't go to Buffalo. He gets so many invitations to continue this speaking tour. By the time he arrives back in New York to board the trains to go back west, the New York Tribune has already brought the speech out in pamphlet form. William Seward has given his great speech on the floor of the Senate, which will be overshadowed, unbeknownst to him, by Lincoln's great address in his backyard. Lincoln goes once more to Beecher's Church and then off to Springfield, where he has written to his wife that the speech went off passably well in New York. His problem, he says, is giving new speeches to people who are reading the speeches in the newspapers. And the speeches all end with iterations of Cooper Union. So they are, in fact, replays of this speech. Within a few months, as you all know, Lincoln, in fact, does win the nomination for the presidency. How did Cooper Union inspire that outcome? Well, not locally. New York's delegates to the convention never broke away from Seward on 3 ballots. He did pick up some support in the New England states that he had visited on the 2nd ballot. They moved to him. But the big impact was the introduction of the speech in pamphlet form, in English, in German, in Washington, in Detroit, in Chicago, in Springfield, in New York. And that photograph, the New York-made photograph, circulating throughout the country, because Lincoln doesn't campaign. True to tradition, although Douglas makes the mistake of saying he's got to go visit his ailing mother in New England and is mocked mercilessly for it because every time the train stops, he makes a speech. As the Democrat, the Northern Democratic candidate, Lincoln stays home. He tries one more time to give that lecture on discoveries and inventions, desperate for that to be a success. He makes a speech about Mormonism, why I don't know. And he speaks to a rally outside his home and says, I really can't speak, but thank you. Imagine a day when there are no campaign speeches. Don't look too wistful or happy. It's not going to happen again. But Lincoln let the Cooper Union speech and the image made there speak for him and campaign for him, and we know how successful it was. A year later, he repeats his path back through New York, which he did not win in the general election. It remained very much Democratic, and on to Washington, where he's importuned into the photo gallery before his inauguration. Matthew Brady has opened a Washington gallery. And the person who brings them there says, Mr. Lincoln, I'd like to introduce you to Mr. Brady, the photographer. And Lincoln says something like, the precise words are lost. Oh, I need no introduction to Mr. Brady. Mr. Brady and the Cooper Union speech made me president. So I think in the end, if it's good enough for Lincoln, it should be good enough for us. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions, and I'll ask you to keep your questions brief so we can get as many answers as possible.
Your book sits right next to my rocking chair. I have an appointment with it. What is the reaction and how much of the speech is reprinted in Southern newspapers? And what is some of the reaction among some of the editorial writers there? And did they have it reprinted in whole in some of those Southern newspapers? My contention has always been the South always never seems to get a really true full story. It gets so twisted sometimes.
I'm worried about you reading it while you're rocking. It's not, got to keep you awake and aware and alert. But anyway. All right, good. There was no complete reproduction of the speech in the South that I've been able to find. It was largely ignored. It's, at the beginning, a Republican Party phenomenon. It's within the party. It's a speech that resonates in the battle for the nomination. There was one comment in the Richmond Whig, which has a correspondent in New York, apparently, and is railing against this series of abolitionists who are appearing in New York, and clearly the black Republicans are taking hold of the party, even in old New York. That's the one reaction.
So basically they're not even getting the full story if these newspaper reporters down in the South are only occasionally having a correspondent from a northern.
Well, the only way they would get the story, I suppose, is if they had, not that commerce was restricted, but the only way they would be interested is if they had gotten their copy of the New York Tribune in the southern cities, and there are already reports that the Tribune is being confiscated by anti-northern people in the post office.
Hello?
I hear you. I could repeat it if you like.
I'm sure that you've seen those pictures of the campaign poster on the eve of the Republican National Convention in 1860, where you had the various candidates and so forth, the Seward in the center and Chase close by. And what I've been wondering was whether or not, in light of the Cooper Union speech, whether or not Chase and Seward are, my understanding, concluded that they were going to be the nominees for that year. Did they have any public or private reaction to that speech? Did they feel that Lincoln was a dark horse who should take them down?
The question is whether, and this is based on an illustration in the book, the Harper's Weekly illustration of the leading candidates for the nomination as they enter Chicago. It centers on Seward with the other people spread all around, and a small picture on the bottom of Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln is still operating under the radar screen a bit, but the fact that he is now portrayed in such an assemblage is a major step forward, has been a major step forward, and is reflective of the impact of the speech on the imminent publication of the Lincoln-Douglas debates, of his increasing stature in the party. Seward's reaction. We know his reaction to the endorsement of the Chicago Press and Tribune. When he sees the editor of the Chicago Press and Tribune, he's furious, and he vents his fury. And this is after the nomination, after he loses the nomination. He says, you bypassed me for that Western something or other. So he's furious about it. Chase, I mean, who can understand Salmon P. Chase? This whole New York series was arranged to benefit Salmon P. Chase. Tom Corwin from Ohio came to speak. Cassius Marcellus Clay came to speak. Salmon P. Chase says he's too busy to speak. And he actually takes a train through New York going home from another speaking engagement and he just doesn't get it. I think that's the answer with Chase. He just doesn't get it. It's run by a guy, the event is run by a guy who runs the Ohio State Agency in New York, sort of like a Chamber of Commerce group. One more. Yes, sir.
In the head count that Lincoln goes through with the speech, do you have any feeling as to whether he pushes the evidence with respect to certain individuals and to what extent?
Did you all hear the beginning of the question? The litany of signers of the Constitution. Lincoln recites the names and talks about how they voted on subsequent issues that included the banning of slavery and how they handled the question of banning slavery in Northwest Ordinance questions, Louisiana Purchase questions. Sure, he pushed the evidence a little bit. I mean, he chose a group of people who I think he suspected had voted with a majority on omnibus bills that included the new territories of the United States. Although there was a genuine movement to keep slavery out of the Northwest Territory, and George Washington supported it. So he concludes that 21 of the 39 signers of the Constitution had expressly, through the Missouri Compromise, some of the old guys, had expressly said that they were opposed to, that they believed in the federal authority to ban slavery. And then he counts another more than a dozen who, by their inclination, he surmises or concludes with a little slickly, that they were against slavery, therefore they can count in that list. Yeah, it's a very slick count, but he's a really good lawyer, really good courtroom arguer and manipulator, in the best sense of the word.